Hey there. Tonight we're not walking into a battlefield or a plague-ridden village. We're stepping into something far stranger and a little bit shinier. We're talking about medieval fashion, not the romanticized version you see in paintings or costume dramas, not just velvet robes and shiny crowns. We're digging into the weird, the worn, and the downright what were they thinking, parts of what people actually wore, from kings in 10-foot trains to peasants patching their tunics with scraps of old sackcloth. Because clothing wasn't just about comfort, it was status, law, sin, identity, and sometimes punishment. You'll learn why peasants sometimes wore shoes made of rope, why nobles stuffed their sleeves with feathers, and why showing your ankles could get you in real trouble. So if this kind of strange, slow, immersive history helps you relax, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. And if you're still listening by the end, drop a comment. What's the most ridiculous outfit you've ever worn? Now, settle in, loosen your belt, and let's unravel the threads of the Middle Ages, one surprising stitch at a time. Let's begin. Sumptuary laws. Dress like a peasant, or else you'd think fashion was about choice. But in the Middle Ages, what you wore could land you in court, because in medieval Europe there were laws, sumptuary laws, that told you exactly what you were allowed to wear, depending on who you were. Not in a polite, whispered way, in a this is written down and you can be fined or worse kind of way. The colour of your cloak, the length of your sleeves, the fabric of your hat, the fur on your collar, all of it had rules. Laws that told peasants to look like peasants, and kings to make sure no one looked too much like them. It wasn't just about modesty, it was about control. The church said wearing rich clothes encouraged vanity. The crown said it threatened order. So if you were a merchant doing well for yourself, and you bought a tunic in silk, or lined your sleeves with squirrel fur like a minor noble, that could get you fined. Worse, it could get you noticed. In 1363, England passed a law stating that only the royal family could wear cloth of gold. Knights and barons were allowed fur, but only of certain animals. Merchants could wear satin, but not velvet. Peasants, linen, wool, leather if they could afford it, but nothing more. And if you broke the law, you might have your clothes taken from you, publicly. Or be ordered to dye your fine tunic brown so no one mistook you for your betters. The irony? The poor often didn't want to dress like nobles. They just wanted warmth, a heavier cloak, a better boot. But fashion wasn't just warmth in the Middle Ages, it was a warning system, a walking label of your place in the world. The fool said, "A man in red without a title is a thief with a tailor." He wasn't wrong, because in this world, wearing the wrong thing could make you powerful or dangerous, or both. And so, medieval fashion wasn't just strange, it was policed. Pointy shoes were so extreme, they had to be banned. Fashion has always flirted with absurdity, but in the Middle Ages it pointed straight at it, literally. Let's talk about the Krakow, also known as the poulain, also known as the most ridiculous footwear ever approved by high society. These were shoes, long, thin, pointy shoes. How pointy? Some stretched nearly 2 feet past the wearer's actual toes, curved upward like a hook. Some were stiffened with whalebone, others stuffed with moss or wool to keep the shape. And they weren't hidden under long robes. No, these were worn to be seen. Popular in the 14th and 15th centuries, they started in Eastern Europe, hence Krakow, named for Krakow, and quickly spread through England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire like wildfire on velvet. They were expensive, impractical, utterly fascinating, and they were a statement. The longer the point, the higher your status. Knights wore them to banquets, courtiers wore them in church. Some nobles even chained the tips of their poulains to their knees to keep from tripping. But not everyone was impressed. clergy condemned them as sinful, absurd, and instruments of vanity. Kings passed laws restricting their length. In 1463, England decreed that no one below the rank of lord could wear points longer than 2 inches. Violators could be fined or have the shoes destroyed. Still, they persisted. Because in the strange theatre of medieval fashion, suffering for style wasn't a modern invention, it was a badge of honour. The fool joked, if your shoes touch the floor, you're either poor or walking wrong. People laughed, but they still bought the shoes. Even peasants tried to mimic the look, stuffing extra cloth in the toe, stitching crude extensions onto their rough leather soles. They couldn't afford the real thing, but they could pretend, and that was the point. Because sometimes medieval fashion wasn't about function at all. It was about illusion, and a shoe that made walking painful, that just meant you had servants to carry you. Hair was a social weapon, especially if you were a woman. In the Middle Ages, your hairstyle could speak louder than your words, especially if you were female. Because hair wasn't just hair, it was morality, identity, status, shame, power, and the rules. They changed depending on your station, your age, and whether or not you were married. For young, unmarried noble women, long, loose hair was the symbol of purity, a literal crown of innocence, braided, brushed, perfumed, sometimes threaded with ribbons or gold thread. Letting it flow freely wasn't just allowed, it was expected. But the moment you married, the hair went away, tied back, bound up, hidden beneath veils, wimples, or headdresses so elaborate they needed scaffolding. Not showing your hair became a symbol of virtue, of modesty, of knowing your place. And God helped the woman who defied that. A wife seen with her hair loose in public, she'd be whispered about, accused of vanity, or worse, of inviting attention. In some regions, a married woman caught without her head covering could be fined. In others, she might be dragged to church and shamed. It wasn't just about beauty. Hair was seen as dangerous. Clergy warned that long, uncovered hair tempted men to sin, that braiding it was prideful, that styling it too well was practically sorcery. But women found loopholes. They plucked their foreheads to raise their hairlines, because high foreheads were the height of beauty. They bleached their hair with lye or crushed flowers to lighten it. They padded their headdresses with wool to make them appear taller, wider, more regal. And poor women, they didn't have the luxury of veils or time. Hair was pulled back in rough knots. Covered with linen if possible, if not, bound with whatever was available, twine, leather, string. Still, the rules reached them too, because in the medieval world, a woman's hair was never just her own. It belonged to her station, her faith, her family, her role, and whether it was hidden under a veil or dragging behind her like a bridal banner, every strand meant something. Fashion, in that sense, wasn't just fabric. It grew from the scalp. Peasant fashion wasn't always dull. It was smart. We picture it wrong. When we think of peasants, we imagine mud-coloured tunics, shapeless sacks, rough cloth that never changed. But here's the truth. Peasant clothing was practical, clever, and sometimes even, shockingly, fashionable. They didn't have gold or silks or 10 changes of clothes. But what they did have, they used well. Peasant garments were made mostly from wool, spun, dyed and woven locally. But they weren't just grey or brown, they were green, russet, blue, yellow, all made from plants, minerals and sometimes even insects. Colour wasn't reserved for nobility, it just came in different shades. The cut of the clothes mattered too. A long tunic could be hitched up with a belt to keep it off the mud. Cloaks were often half circular and pinned at the shoulder. A simple hood, known as a liripipe, could be extended into a long tail that doubled as a scarf or even a rope in a pinch. Layers were key. Under tunics made of linen helped wick away sweat. Over tunics, heavier and more resistant, offered protection from rain and cold. Everything had a purpose, and often more than one. And yes, they mended. Constantly. Patches weren't a sign of shame, they were signs of survival. Clothes were passed down, remade, resized, sometimes completely restitched into something new. Children wore sleeves from older siblings. Skirts were reshaped into tunics, and the fool once joked that a peasant woman's cloak had seen more winters than the village elder's goat. And footwear? If you were lucky, leather shoes. If not, rope sandals, wrapped cloth, or bare feet hardened like hooves. But even peasants could care about how they looked. On feast days they wore their best, a freshly washed tunic, maybe a bit of embroidery if they'd had the time and thread, a bright sash, a borrowed cloak. These weren't just clothes, they were pride, identity, dignity. Because even if you were born into the dirt, you didn't have to look like it every day. Fashion wasn't just for nobles, it belonged to anyone clever enough to make something out of nothing. Royal wardrobes were so huge, they travelled separately. You think packing for vacation is hard? Try being a medieval king, because when royalty travelled in the Middle Ages, whether for war, diplomacy or pilgrimage, they didn't just bring a change of clothes, they brought an entire building's worth. Royal wardrobes were so vast they had their own carts, their own staff, sometimes their own tent. Why? Because clothing was politics. The noble's appearance wasn't about comfort, it was a signal, a display of wealth, power and divine favour. The fabric, colour, trim and even the number of garments worn at once were all carefully chosen to show superiority. A king might travel with 15 cloaks of varying weight, dozens of tunics each for a different function, hunting, dining, ceremony, mourning, spare gloves, hoods, belts and shoes, many in duplicate, in case one pair was soiled, capes embroidered with gold or silver thread, undergarments made of imported linen. And yes, all of this travelled with him, in trunks, in chests, in wagons, just for clothes. Some monarchs had entire departments devoted to it. In England, there was the wardrobe office, staffed with clerks and tailors who managed not only the storage, but also the ongoing repair and inventory of royal garments. These people travelled with the king, kept records of every hem, every pearl, every stitch that came loose. In France, wardrobes were sometimes constructed in temporary buildings ahead of a king's arrival, just so his garments could be unpacked properly and stored in order. And the weight? Some royal convoys had 10 or more carts just for clothing and linens. Add in ceremonial armour and regalia, and the wardrobe moved like a small army of its own. Why go through all the trouble? Because arriving in a wrinkled cloak or a faded robe could offend the host. Because looking less than divine meant looking weak. Because power, in the medieval world, had to be seen to be believed. So yes, when the king rolled into town, the clothes arrived first, sometimes by a full day. Because medieval fashion wasn't an afterthought, it was a kingdom on wheels. The stranger the sleeve, the higher the status. In modern fashion, sleeves are background noise, functional, invisible. In the Middle Ages, sleeves were a statement, a loud, flapping, occasionally hazardous statement of class, vanity, and wealth. Let's start with the basics. In the 14th and 15th centuries, sleeve design went wild. Long, trailing sleeves that dragged behind you like banners. Sleeves so wide they could catch the wind. Sleeves so heavy with embroidery and fur that they needed support underneath to keep from tearing off the gown. Why? Because sleeves weren't about warmth or movement. They were about status. If your sleeves could graze the ground, it meant you didn't work with your hands. You didn't carry buckets or chop wood or kneel in the dirt. You were important. You had people to lift your fabric for you. Nobles competed over sleeve design. Some were detachable, tied in at the shoulder with laces or fancy buttons. Others were sewn in, so long they had to be looped over the arm like scarves. And the materials? Rich brocades, velvet, fur linings. Slits were cut to let the undersleeve puff through, in a display of both layering and wealth. The more contrast, the better. Gold with crimson, emerald with pearl. Entire sleeve designs were documented and recreated across courts as fashion spread from castle to castle, like rumour. Even men got in on it, especially men. By the late medieval period, noblemen wore sleeves so exaggerated they looked more like capes stitched to their shoulders. Some featured open seams, revealing layers beneath. Others were stuffed with wool or down to bulk them out. But here's the twist. Sleeves had meanings. In some cases, they were given as tokens of affection, literally cut from a lady's gown and worn by a knight in battle. In other cases, a torn sleeve might symbolize grief. For peasants, sleeves were short, tight, practical. Any extra fabric was a hazard. You wore what you could afford, and nothing more. But for the nobility, the longer and more useless the sleeve, the more powerful you looked, even if you couldn't fit through a door without folding yourself like a tent. Fur wasn't just fashion, it was status and scandal. To us, fur is a luxury. To a medieval noble, fur was law, not literally but almost, because in the Middle Ages, fur wasn't just something you wore for warmth, it was something you wore to prove who you were, and sometimes who you weren't allowed to be. Let's start with the basics. Everyone wore fur, yes, even peasants. But the kind of fur? That was where things got complicated. Peasants wore sheepskin, goat, or at best, rabbit. Cheap, local warm, but not impressive. Nobles? They wore squirrel, fox, marten, beaver, ermine, and even imported leopard or lynx. The rarer the fur, the more expensive. The more expensive, the more powerful you appeared. Some cloaks were fully lined with fur, some hoods were trimmed, some boots were wrapped in it. In royal courts, fur was expected, not optional. If you arrived in wool alone, people assumed you'd fallen from favour. But here's the shocking part. Not everyone was allowed to wear certain furs. Sumptuary laws again. In England, only the upper nobility could wear ermine, the white winter coat of a stoat, considered the most prestigious fur of all. Squirrel fur, particularly the bluish-grey kind from Eastern Europe known as vair, was reserved for barons and above. Merchants caught wearing noble fur, fined. Artisans who lined their hats with the wrong pelt, punished. Fur, like so many things in the Middle Ages, was a language, and sometimes it sparked scandal. Clergy who wore rich fur were criticised for vanity. Women who wore too much of it were accused of being haughty or worse. One French duchess was mocked in poetry for having more mink than manners. And yet the hunger for fur grew. It became a sign of winter wealth, of marriage prospects, of royal favour. Entire wardrobes were catalogued based on what animal lined what sleeve. Even the fool got in on it once, wrapping his boots in rat skins and saying, "Now I walk like a king, if the king lived in a cellar." No one laughed, because the joke was close to truth. In the Middle Ages, fur was the line between warmth and power, and if your coat was lined right, you didn't just look rich, you belonged. Codpieces were the boldest fashion statement. No one asked for it, started with function. But like so many things in medieval fashion, it ended in spectacle. Let's talk about the codpiece, that strange, unmistakable flap of fabric, padded and proud, sitting front and centre on a man's trousers. At first it was innocent. Men in the 14th century wore hose, tight, form-fitting leggings that were often joined in the back and laced to a tunic. But that left one problem: the front, specifically a rather awkward gap that needed covering. The solution: a triangular piece of cloth tied over the opening, a codpiece from the Middle English cod meaning bag. Simple, practical. But then came fashion, and the codpiece began to grow. By the 15th and 16th centuries, it wasn't just a cover, it was a statement. Stuffed, padded, sometimes decorated with embroidery, buttons, or even tassels. Some were shaped and sculpted like armour. Others exaggerated the male form to comical extremes. They became, quite literally, the centrepiece of noble male attire. Why? Power, fertility, masculinity, and, let's be honest, ego. Noblemen posed with one hand on their codpiece in portraits. Tailors competed to design the boldest look. Even kings wore them. Henry VIII's portraits famously feature codpieces that could double as wine goblets. The church wasn't amused. Clergy denounced them as vulgar. Satirists mocked them in plays and pamphlets. The fool claimed a man could store his lunch inside one, and some actually did. Small pouches were sewn inside to hold coins, herbs, or keys. But the codpiece wasn't just ridiculous, it was also a response to reality. In an era when diseases like syphilis spread through Europe, padding the groin was sometimes seen as protective. Some were even infused with herbs or lined with waxed linen to shield the wearer from illness. And still, they grew, until fashion finally moved on and the codpiece faded out, leaving behind only paintings and punchlines. But for a few glorious decades, it was king, and in a world ruled by power, pride, and appearance, it made sure everyone was looking in the same direction. Hats were more than style, they were law, status, and armour. In the Middle Ages, you didn't just wear a hat, you announced yourself with one. From felt caps to towering hennins to wide-brimmed leather hats that looked like flying saucers, medieval headwear was 1 part fashion, 1 part survival, and 2 parts social broadcast. For men, hats were everywhere. Merchants wore soft felt hats with upturned brims. Nobles sported tall, brimless hats wrapped in coloured fabric. Pilgrims had broad, low domes, often decorated with badges showing where they'd been. And peasants? Straw hats, simple, functional, meant to keep the sun and snow off, not impress anyone. But even these had rules. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what on their heads. Certain materials, like silk or fur-lined caps, were forbidden to commoners. A peasant caught in a merchant's hat might be fined. A merchant caught in a nobleman's headpiece might lose more than coin. And for women? Headwear was an entire language of its own. The hennin. That iconic cone-shaped hat that soared over the head like a candle was worn by noble women, especially in France and Burgundy. It could reach 3 feet high and was often covered in sheer veils that floated behind like banners. Ridiculous, maybe, but also powerful. Because wearing a hennin said, I'm wealthy, I don't work, and I won't bow because I physically can't. Other headdresses included wimples, face-framing linen worn by married women, crispinets, hairnets often made of gold wire, and elaborate veils stacked and pinned with terrifying precision. Headwear even crept into religion. Clergy wore berettas, bishops had mitres, monks shaved their heads and covered them with cowls. Even fools had their own, colourful caps with bells, horns or ears, reminding everyone that even chaos had a costume. And sometimes, a hat wasn't just fashion, it was armour. Heavy leather hoods, iron-studded caps, chainmail coifs worn beneath helmets, because when winter came or war found its way to your village, the same item that shaded your face could protect your skull. So yes, hats in the Middle Ages were strange, but they were also smart. They told the world who you were, how much you earned, what you believed, and whether you were worth talking to, or just worth bowing to. belts were basically medieval toolkits, and fashion too. In the Middle Ages, your belt was more than just something to hold your pants up. It was your toolkit, your wallet, your social badge, and sometimes your weapon. Let's unpack that. Both men and women wore belts, often called girdles, and they were essential. Not just for fashion, but for function. For peasants, a belt carried the day. It held your knife, your pouch of coins or grain, a key to your chest if you were lucky enough to have one, a spoon or fire striker, maybe a small cloth bag of salt or herbs. Some even tied a chunk of bread or a flask of ale right to it. In short, it was your pocket, in a world that didn't have any. For nobles, belts were about status. They were wider, longer, more decorative, studded with metal, embroidered with silk. Some trailed nearly to the knees, and the dangling end was often weighted with metal to swing just so when walking. It was meant to draw the eye, to say, "Look at me, I don't work, I decorate." Some belts had inscriptions, religious verses, family mottos or personal charms sewn into the lining. Others were so richly made that a single noble belt could be worth more than a peasant's home. Women's belts were often thinner, sometimes made of braided silk or soft leather. A married woman might wear a girdle with symbols of chastity or fertility, especially during pregnancy. And during ceremonies such as marriage or knighthood, gifting a belt was deeply symbolic. It meant trust, loyalty, or even surrender. And yes, belts were used as weapons. A leather belt, doubled and swung, could end a tavern brawl fast. The fool claimed he once beat a thief using nothing but his girdle and a prayer. But belts weren't just about what you carried. They also shaped how you looked. By the 14th century, fashion shifted toward a tighter silhouette. Tunics were cinched at the waist. Belts helped emphasize the figure, for men and women alike. Nobles often posed with one hand resting casually on the buckle, signaling both wealth and posture. In short, a medieval belt was a little bit toolbox, a little bit jewelry, a little bit authority, and if you lost it, you weren't just underdressed, you were undefended. Jewelry had rules, and sometimes a pulse. When we think of medieval jewelry, we imagine gold rings and jeweled crowns, but that's only part of the story. Because in the Middle Ages, jewelry wasn't just adornment, it was law, superstition, medicine, and sometimes very much alive. Let's start with who could wear it. As with most things in medieval fashion, there were rules. Sumptuary laws dictated which classes could wear gold, silver, pearls, or precious stones. Peasants? Forbidden. Merchants? Maybe silver. Nobles? Yes, but even they had to follow codes about which gems were suitable for which ranks. Jewelry wasn't just about wealth, it was about place, but even more fascinating was why people wore it. Amulets were everywhere, pieces of metal or bone strung on cord, worn under clothes or sewn into hems. They were meant to ward off illness, protect against curses, or bring luck in childbirth. A tooth from a dog, a scrap of holy cloth, a polished stone thought to ward off fever. Even the church, which scolded excess, made room for sacred jewelry. Crosses, rings etched with saints, relic lockets containing fragments of bone or splinters from the true cross. Then there were the healing jewels. It was widely believed that certain stones had medicinal powers. Garnet for wounds, amethyst for drunkenness, sapphire to calm anger, jet, a black fossilized wood, to protect against demons. But here's the wildest part. Some jewelry was made with live things inside it. Yes, really. Tiny cages built into pendants held insects, frogs, or even beetles, especially in magical or folk traditions. These weren't common, but they were real. The idea was that the living creature absorbed the sickness or deflected curses. Think of it as medieval, wearable magic. Jewelry was also layered with romance and danger. A lover might give a ring etched with their initials. A knight might wear a lady's hair inside a locket. Poison rings, yes, they existed, were rare but terrifying. With a tiny hidden chamber, they could deliver powder or liquid with a single twist. For most people, jewelry wasn't just decoration. It was faith, identity, protection, power. And sometimes it wasn't even pretty, just personal, and possibly still wriggling. The cloak was a blanket, a badge, and sometimes a burial shroud. In a world without central heating, cars, or even proper windows, one garment ruled them all: the cloak. It was more than a fashion statement. It was survival. The medieval cloak was simple in concept. A large piece of heavy wool cut into a half-circle or full-circle shape, fastened at the shoulder or throat with a brooch, a pin, or a leather tie. Some had hoods, others didn't. Some dragged the ground, others were cropped above the waist. But no matter the shape, every class wore one. And yet, not all cloaks were equal. A king's cloak might be lined with fur, sable, fox, or ermine, embroidered in gold thread and trimmed with silk. It might take months to make and be so valuable it had to be guarded in the royal wardrobe when not worn. A peasant's cloak, by contrast, might be rough wool dyed with onion skin or left its natural muddy brown. It was patched with linen or even sackcloth, and yet it was one of the most precious things a poor man owned. Because a cloak wasn't just worn, it was lived in. You slept in it, used it as a blanket, covered your family with it during storms, rolled your belongings in it when travelling. In a world where homes were drafty and beds were straw, your cloak was often the warmest, softest thing you had. And if you died, it might become your shroud. It was not uncommon for the poor to be buried in their own cloaks, especially in the colder months. Not because of ceremony, but because they had nothing else fit to be buried in. Cloaks also had meaning. A brightly coloured cloak signalled wealth. A dyed red or blue cloak meant access to rare pigments. A black cloak often indicated mourning. A military cloak might bear a symbol, a seal, a crest. Cloaks could mark you as a pilgrim or a thief, depending on how you wore it and where you stood. And yes, fashion played its part. Cloaks were cut longer in court, sometimes made intentionally heavy to sweep the floor. For nobles, the sweep of a cloak was like the train of a wedding dress, impressive, impractical, and very, very intentional. The fool once said, "A man is as grand as the trail behind him." And in the Middle Ages that wasn't far from the truth, because a cloak wasn't just clothing. It was your bed, your warmth, your shield, your display, and in the end, it might just be your final garment. Perfume, gloves, and poisoned fabrics. Fashion could kill. Sometimes medieval fashion wasn't just strange, it was deadly. Let's start with perfume gloves. Yes, they were real. And no, not everyone wore them for sweetness. Among the upper class, gloves weren't just a hand covering, they were a scented experience. Made of fine leather or silk, lined with fur and soaked in essential oils, rose, lavender, clove, or orange blossom. Some had pouches sewn into the cuffs for small herbs or scented powder. Why? Because the medieval world smelled bad. Open sewage, animal dung, unwashed bodies. A noble might raise a gloved hand to their nose to block the stink. A lady might twirl a perfume glove while walking through the market. Even bishops wore scented gloves at Mass. Not just for ceremony, but as a buffer against the congregation. But here's where it gets sinister. Scented gloves were sometimes poisoned, fact or legend, a little of both. Historical records tell of assassins anointing gloves with subtle toxins, absorbed through the skin or inhaled slowly over time. One infamous tale tells of Queen Elizabeth I receiving a pair laced with poison. She didn't wear them. The giver disappeared. nothing proven, but the fear lingered. Perfumed fabrics, too, were both luxury and liability. Some clothes were dyed with materials containing lead, mercury or arsenic, especially cosmetics and pigments for makeup, gloves and lace collars. The richer the colour, the more suspicious the chemistry. And for fashionistas who powdered their faces white or rouged their cheeks, the risk was real. Even the dyes themselves, especially deep reds, purples and greens, could contain heavy metals absorbed through sweat. And still, people wore them, because fashion was risk, because status came before safety, and because no one wanted to be seen in dull brown when court demanded brilliance. The fool once said, "If the smell don't kill you, the colour might." It was a joke, sort of, because in the Middle Ages the right glove could woo a suitor, and the wrong one could end you. Fashion was used to humiliate criminals. Most people think of fashion as self-expression, but in the Middle Ages it could be punishment, because when words failed, when prisons were full, when shame was the goal, people were made to wear their crimes. Let's start with one of the most infamous tools, the pillory outfit. Yes, the pillory, the wooden frame you were locked into in the centre of town. But what you wore while standing there, that was part of the sentence. Thieves might be stripped to their shirts, adulterers forced to wear back-to-front clothing, drunkards paraded in mismatched oversized rags. Sometimes people were made to wear signs listing their crimes, or hats shaped like the objects they stole, or painted hoods with animal ears, to mimic the sin of acting like a beast, even more extreme. Tailored shame. Bakers who cheated customers could be sewn into a sack of their own spoiled flour. Gossiping women might be forced to wear iron muzzles, known as scold's bridles, with long steel tongues that prevented speech. And it wasn't always about what you did. Sometimes it was who you were. Jews in certain kingdoms were forced by law to wear badges, often yellow circles sewn onto cloaks or hats. Prostitutes in medieval Italy wore distinct colours or ribbons to mark their status. Lepers wore special cloaks and carried wooden clappers to warn of their approach. Fashion in these cases wasn't for identity, it was for isolation, to keep people out, or keep them down. Even inside prisons, clothing marked hierarchy. A debtor might wear patched linen, a murderer coarse sack. Some sentences required wearing humiliating outfits for weeks in public, even after the punishment had ended. The fool once said, "In this town, they measure sin in stitches." And he wasn't wrong, because in the medieval world, if you broke the rules, you didn't just lose your freedom, you lost your dignity, thread by thread. Fashion was so political, it could start a war. At first glance, a cloak is just a cloak. But in the Middle Ages, clothing could spark rebellion, because fashion wasn't just appearance, it was allegiance. Take the Wars of the Roses in 15th century England, a dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York, symbolised by red and white roses. But those weren't just flowers, they were colours, worn on purpose. To wear white in a Lancaster stronghold was a political statement. To wear red in a York village, a gamble, sometimes even dangerous. Colours were chosen, stitched and worn like banners, and sometimes people died for them. And it wasn't just England. In France, certain colours were associated with royal favour. Wearing deep blue or golden thread might suggest ties to the monarchy, even if you had none, which made tailors cautious and nobles paranoid. An ambitious merchant with the wrong trim could be accused of aspiration, or worse, treason. Then there were the heraldic surcoats. Tabards, worn over armour or ceremonial robes, bore the colours and emblems of powerful families. Lions, crosses, fleur-de-lis. These weren't decorative, they were signals. To see someone ride in wearing a rival's coat of arms was as much a challenge as drawing a sword. Even commoners used fashion to resist. In some towns, banned colours or stolen trims became symbols of protest. A group of labourers might all wear green hoods to demand fair wages. A banned dye might reappear in underground markets, worn at night by those who refused to obey. One chronicler even records a village uprising in which peasants sewed royal-looking cloaks and mocked nobles until guards were sent in. So yes, fashion could be playful, powerful, dangerous, and political. The fool once said, "If you want to know who rules, look at who's allowed to sparkle." Because in a world without microphones or mass media, a person's clothes shouted, and sometimes that shout started a fight. So now the buttons are unfastened, the laces untied, and we've come to the end of our walk through medieval fashion. Threadbare, extravagant, strange and unforgettable. Because whether it was a peasant's patched tunic or a queen's crown of fur and pearls, clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't just about covering the body. It was about showing the world who you were, or who you wanted them to believe you were. Every stitch whispered something about faith, about fear, about power, and in a time when not everyone could read or write, fashion became its own language, spoken in silk, fur, blood, and thread. Thank you for travelling back through it with me. If this quiet kind of history helps you slow down, helps you breathe a little deeper at the end of the day, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I make these to share a peace, not noise, and let me know in the comments, what's the most uncomfortable thing you've ever worn? Because I guarantee somewhere in the 1300s, someone outdid you on purpose. Until next time, sleep warm, dress strange, and never underestimate the power of a sleeve.